I call the Honourable Philip Goff.
Mr Speaker, once again we have an important piece of legislation coming into the House that may be necessary, but the case has not been made out for it, that is certainly intrusive on the privacy and the individual rights of New Zealand citizens, but again fails to indicate the checks and balances that might exist to prevent those powers being abused, and a piece of legislation that is brought in under urgency, where National Speaker after National Speaker, instead of making out the case for why this legislation is necessary, what protections there might be to stop its powers being abused, stand up, utter, mumble a few inane sentences and sit down. And there is a responsibility on the government of this country when in the night and under urgency they try to rush a piece of legislation through to actually justify what they're doing to the country. You know, there has been a tradition in this House where a government acts reasonably for there to be an effort to achieve a bipartisan consensus to get intrusive legislation through the House. In this legislation, there has been no effort. It wasn't tabled until today. And when the Minister brought the bill in its printed form, makes this comments about the regulatory impact statements. There are wide-ranging powers in this bill. We need to know what Treasury and what the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment say are the implications of this legislation. And what do we read in the bill? These regulatory impact statements have yet to be publicly released on the Ministry's website. I want to ask the government why it's good enough for them to bring in a bill that gives unprecedented powers to government over telecommunications companies and intruding into the lives of private New Zealand citizens, that they don't deem it necessary to table the regulatory impact statements so the whole House can be informed about what this bill means for New Zealanders. That is a breach of process. That is utter arrogance, matching the arrogance of national members that stand up, speak 3 sentences and then jeer from their seats when other people are criticising the way this bill has been put together. I want to make this point about the bill. This bill is going to the Law and Order Select Committee. I sit on that Select Committee, and interestingly, our Select Committee had before it a corrections amendment bill. Members of the committee are in the House right now and they can confirm that. And this submission is from 3 telecommunication companies, 2 Degrees, Vodafone and Telecom. And, you know, this is evidence, Mr Speaker, that the government never learns from its failures, it never learns from the fiascos and the botch-ups that it's already made. This is what the companies say. It's unfortunate that we weren't consulted on the bill before the process began. This is a bill in the corrections context giving power over telecommunications companies, a parallel to this legislation before it, and the telecommunication companies came to the committee and said, we didn't know about it before the government introduced it. And my challenge to the National Party is this: did they consult with the telecommunication companies? Did they ask whether the measures were effective, were able to be implemented, were necessary, whether there were better ways of doing it, whether it unnecessarily intruded on privacy? Silence. You know the answer, Mr Speaker. The answer is they did not consult with the companies that are dramatically affected by these legislative powers. And what do we find about their last effort to do this that went to the Law and Order Committee? That the bill would have had unintended consequences. That the telecommunications providers actually didn't have the capability to do what the government was demanding of it. That it gave the department search and surveillance powers over and above any others that existed for government agencies. That it failed to take into account better ways of doing it. That it gave the set out costs that ran into millions of dollars, and it was an unjustified intrusion into the privacy rights of individuals. Mr. Speaker, do you know what the result of that submission was? Everything the telecommunications company said about that intrusion and those powers was absolutely correct, and the government slunk off with its tail between its legs. It withdrew the provisions in the legislation and it put into effect provisions that the telecom companies said were necessary, useful, pragmatic and with proper checks and balances. This government learns nothing from its experience. It brings this bill into the House with unprecedented powers. It hasn't consulted the opposition parties. It hasn't consulted the telecommunications companies. And my fear is that our committee will find exactly what it found last time the government tried to implement something like this. What they were recommending wouldn't work, couldn't be done, was expensive, abused the rights of ordinary New Zealanders and failed to protect, where it was necessary to do so, the privacy of individuals. You know, I wonder what this legislation is about. Some time ago, I was talking to people representing the Australian government, the American government. They asked me this question. They said, you know, you're worried about cyber security. Why is it that the national government has agreed to allow Huawei to set up communications networks in New Zealand that we in Australia and we in the United States wouldn't do because of the fundamental impact that would have on undermining cyber security in their countries? So on one hand, the government has gone out and it's agreed to something that its closest friends and allies apparently thought was stupid, and then on the other hand, they bring this legislation in. Maybe they are bringing this legislation in because in retrospect they realise they've done the wrong thing and they've opened New Zealand up to the sort of cyber attacks through foreign-owned companies that other countries with similar democracies haven't done. So I ask the next government speaker not to mutter something inane when they get up and sit down again, but to answer that question. Answer all of those questions. Is this about Huawei? Why is it that there has been no communications with the telecom companies? Why is it that we found out about this legislation only when it was tabled, and that there was no effort, as you would normally expect, to give a briefing to the opposition on legislation that provides for a massive expansion of government powers? And I want to give an indication of what that massive expansion is. You know, network operators will have to notify the director of the GCSB of, quote, any proposed decision, course of action or change to procurement of any equipment, system or service, any change to those or any change of ownership of any of them. What remarkable powers that the GCSB will have over communications companies. Why is this deemed to be necessary at this time? Is it about Huawei? Or is it because the government just thinks that they should be able to go in and direct anything that the private communications companies are doing? It says that they must notify the GCSB before they go out to the market for any new equipment. Huge intrusion on what the telecommunications companies are doing. Not been necessary in the past. Why is it necessary now? The GCSB is to have a veto power over network operators upgrading, introducing new network equipment if, in the GCSB's director's opinion, they pose a security risk. What's the criteria he follows in that? Why isn't that spelled out in the legislation? Is this a total unbridled power? If the director is not satisfied with the proposal, then they can refer it to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister can direct that they stop a particular activity. Enormous powers placed in the hands of the Prime Minister to be directive. Where is the check and balance on that? It may be that they are concerned, for example, about economic well-being of the country. Every day the National Party stands up in the House and argues that every party in opposition is undermining the economic well-being of the country. Is this a clause that would allow the government to spy on the political party's decision-making process because of that? Now, you'd say, that's silly, really, isn't it? Isn't it silly? Isn't that what... The government wouldn't do that, would they? John Key, or actually Bill English, wouldn't suppress the fact that the government had acted illegally in another area. John Key wouldn't lie about his involvement in the appointment of the GCSB director. No, they wouldn't do those things. Mr. Speaker, this is bad legislation, poorly introduced, inadequately explained, no Bill of Rights veto, no checks and balances. The opposition, the Labor opposition, will be opposing this bill.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I begin by acknowledging the